The Berlin Crisis of 1961 emerged not from a single provocation, but from a long-building contradiction at the heart of post-war Europe, as the city of Berlin became the most dangerous fault line of the Cold War, a place where two irreconcilable systems were forced to coexist within the same streets, the same neighborhoods, and even the same families. After the Second World War, Germany was divided into occupation zones, and Berlin, though located deep inside the Soviet zone, was itself partitioned among the victorious powers, creating an anomaly that quickly transformed into a symbol of ideological confrontation, as the western sectors of the city evolved into an island of capitalism and political freedom surrounded by the socialist German Democratic Republic. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, this arrangement generated relentless tension as millions of East Germans used Berlin as an escape route to the West, draining the GDR of skilled workers, professionals, and young people, and exposing the fragility of a state that could not retain its population without coercion. By the end of the 1950s, this exodus had become a crisis for the East German regime, undermining its economy, its legitimacy, and its claim to represent a superior socialist system, while simultaneously embarrassing the Soviet Union, which found itself propping up an ally whose borders remained porous at the very center of Europe. For Western leaders, Berlin functioned as both a moral showcase and a strategic liability, a place where commitment to freedom had to be demonstrated continuously, despite the risk of provoking confrontation with a nuclear-armed adversary. For the Soviets, it was a geopolitical irritant, a Western foothold that challenged their control of Eastern Europe and symbolized the unresolved outcome of the war. This imbalance intensified after the death of Stalin, as Nikita Khrushchev sought to consolidate Soviet authority while testing Western resolve, and by 1958 he openly challenged the post-war settlement by demanding that Berlin be transformed into a demilitarized free city, threatening to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany that would effectively sever Western access routes. This ultimatum forced the Berlin question to the center of Cold War diplomacy, as the United States and its allies refused to relinquish their rights in the city, viewing any retreat as a dangerous precedent that would weaken NATO credibility across Europe. Negotiations dragged on without resolution, punctuated by summits that raised expectations only to dash them, while the underlying problem remained unchanged, as East Germany continued to hemorrhage citizens through Berlin, and the Soviets grew increasingly impatient with a status quo that favored the West. The election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 brought new uncertainty, as Khrushchev attempted to assess the resolve of a young and untested American president, culminating in a disastrous summit in Vienna where mutual mistrust deepened and compromise collapsed, reinforcing the belief on both sides that Berlin could not be settled through diplomacy alone. Within East Germany, Walter Ulbricht pressed relentlessly for decisive action, arguing that the survival of his state required sealing the border, even as Moscow hesitated, wary of triggering a direct confrontation with the West. By mid-1961, the flow of refugees reached unprecedented levels, with tens of thousands fleeing each month, turning Berlin into a hemorrhaging wound at the center of the socialist bloc, and convincing Soviet leaders that inaction posed greater risk than intervention. The solution that emerged was drastic, but carefully calculated to close the border inside Berlin itself, transforming the city from a symbol of open confrontation into a sealed frontier, while avoiding direct interference with Western access rights that might provoke immediate war. This decision, taken in secrecy and implemented with speed, reflected the grim logic of the Cold War, in which stability was often achieved, not through reconciliation, but through physical division, and where walls could seem preferable to escalation. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, East German forces moved swiftly to block streets, lay barbed wire, and cut transport links between East and West Berlin, shocking residents who awoke to find their city abruptly severed, families divided overnight, and escape routes closed by armed guards. What began as wire and checkpoints would soon harden into concrete, steel, and minefields. But even in its earliest hours, the Berlin Wall transformed the crisis from a diplomatic standoff into a visible, brutal manifestation of Cold War reality, forcing both superpowers to confront the consequences of their strategies in the most personal and immediate terms imaginable. The sudden closure of Berlin did not resolve the crisis, but it crystallized it, setting the stage for a direct confrontation between American and Soviet forces that would test nerves, doctrines, and the willingness of leaders to risk catastrophe over a divided city whose fate had become inseparable from the credibility of the Cold War order itself. The erection of the Berlin Wall transformed a chronic Cold War dispute into an immediate and volatile crisis, as the sudden physical division of the city forced the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies to confront the reality of confrontation at street level, where ideology, sovereignty, and military power intersected within sight of one another. For the people of Berlin, the shock was deeply personal, as families were separated without warning, workplaces severed, and familiar routes abruptly cut by armed guards who enforced the new boundary with growing severity. While, for Western leaders, the wall posed a stark dilemma, because while it violated the spirit of post-war agreements, it did not technically block Allied access to West Berlin, leaving few options that did not risk escalation. President Kennedy's administration quickly concluded that the wall, however brutal, was preferable to a military showdown over access rights, a calculation that reflected the grim pragmatism of Cold War crisis management, in which preventing war often meant accepting injustice. This assessment did little to ease public outrage, as images of barbed wire and divided streets circulated globally, transforming Berlin into the most potent symbol of Cold War repression and sharpening ideological contrast between East and West. Soviet and East German authorities defended the wall as an anti-fascist protective barrier, claiming it was necessary to stop Western subversion. But the reality of armed guards preventing citizens from leaving their own country exposed the fragility of that narrative, reinforcing the perception that the socialist system could survive only by force. The immediate danger lay not in the wall itself, but in the unresolved status of Allied rights in Berlin, particularly the ability of Western diplomats and military personnel to move freely across the city, a freedom guaranteed by post-war agreements and regarded as a non-negotiable test of credibility. Tensions escalated sharply in October 1961 when East German guards, acting under Soviet backing, began demanding identification from American officials at the checkpoint on Friedrichstrasse, a challenge that struck at the heart of Allied authority and threatened to set a precedent that could gradually erode Western presence in the city. The United States responded with a calculated show of force, sending armed military convoys to assert access rights while carefully avoiding actions that might provoke a wider clash, a delicate balancing act that reflected both resolve and restraint. This confrontation reached its most dangerous point at Checkpoint Charlie, where American and Soviet tanks faced each other at close range, their guns trained forward, crews tense, and commanders operating under instructions that emphasized readiness without initiative, a posture that encapsulated the paradox of deterrence, requiring visible force combined with an absolute prohibition on firing. For 16 hours, the standoff persisted, A silent test of nerve played out under the gaze of the world as diplomats worked frantically behind the scenes to defuse the crisis, while soldiers waited for orders that could alter history. The danger of miscalculation was acute, as a single misunderstanding, mechanical failure, or unauthorized action could have triggered an exchange between nuclear-armed superpowers. Yet, the very visibility of the confrontation imposed a measure of discipline, as both sides understood that escalation would be catastrophic and politically indefensible. Eventually, through back-channel communication and mutual recognition of the stakes, the tanks withdrew in a carefully choreographed sequence, each side pulling back one vehicle at a time to avoid the appearance of retreat or victory, a ritualized de-escalation that underscored how much Cold War stability depended on symbolism and face-saving as much as on raw power. The resolution of the tank standoff did not resolve the Berlin crisis, but it established a new equilibrium in which the wall remained, access rights were tacitly respected, and the city became a reminder of division rather than a trigger for immediate war. For Berliners, this equilibrium was cold comfort, as the wall hardened into a permanent feature of daily life, enforced by a lethal border regime that would claim lives over the following decades, while for the superpowers it represented a grim success, stabilizing a volatile situation by freezing it in place. The Berlin crisis of 1961 thus revealed the underlying logic of the Cold War, in which confrontation was managed through controlled displays of force. Compromise was often implicit rather than explicit, and peace was maintained not by resolving contradictions, but by containing them behind concrete and barbed wire. The wall reduced the risk of sudden escalation in Berlin, but at the cost of human freedom and moral clarity, a trade-off that leaders accepted as the price of stability in a divided Europe. This trade-off would shape the city's fate for nearly 3 decades, turning Berlin into both a symbol of oppression and a stage on which the Cold War's most dangerous confrontations were rehearsed and restrained, setting a precedent for crisis management that would influence superpower behavior long after the immediate crisis had passed. The aftermath of the checkpoint. Charlie Standoff marked a subtle but significant shift in Cold War dynamics, as both superpowers drew lessons from how close the confrontation had come to catastrophe and how narrowly it had been avoided, reinforcing a shared understanding that Berlin, though symbolically vital, could not be allowed to trigger a direct military clash. For the United States, the crisis confirmed that credibility could be maintained through firmness short of force, as Kennedy's administration balanced public declarations of resolve with private acceptance of the wall's existence, a strategy that preserved Allied rights in West Berlin while tacitly conceding the division of the city. For the Soviet Union, the outcome validated the decision to seal the border without provoking war, demonstrating that decisive action, if carefully calibrated, could stabilize a dangerous situation and secure the survival of East Germany without crossing Western red lines. This mutual adjustment did not represent reconciliation, but a grudging accommodation shaped by fear, experience, and the recognition of limits, an accommodation that would define the management of Berlin for years to come. In practical terms, the wall transformed the nature of the Cold War in Germany, turning a fluid confrontation marked by mass migration and constant crisis into a rigid standoff in which movement was controlled, dissent suppressed, and the status quo enforced through surveillance and lethal force. East Germany consolidated its authority behind the barrier, rebuilding its economy and security apparatus around the assumption that the population could no longer vote with its feet, while West Berlin evolved into a heavily subsidized outpost of the Western Alliance, its survival guaranteed by political commitment rather than economic logic. The human cost of this stabilization was immense. As families remained divided, escape attempts were met with deadly consequences, and the border regime became a daily reminder of the price paid to preserve geopolitical order. Internationally, the Berlin crisis underscored the dangers inherent in ambiguous sovereignty and divided control, prompting both superpowers to reassess crisis management mechanisms and communication channels, lessons that would influence later efforts to reduce the risk of accidental war. The experience reinforced the importance of back-channel diplomacy and direct leader-to-leader communication, contributing to a gradual recognition that misunderstandings and miscalculations posed as great a threat as deliberate aggression in a nuclear-armed world. Within NATO, the crisis strengthened commitment to West Berlin as a test case of alliance credibility, even as it highlighted the need for restraint and coordination to prevent local incidents from escalating into global conflict. Within the Warsaw Pact, the Wall and its acceptance by the West reinforced the principle that internal control was paramount, even if it required measures that damaged international legitimacy, a principle that would shape responses to later challenges in Eastern Europe. Over time, the Wall became normalized in Cold War consciousness, its presence taken for granted, even as it continued to symbolize division and repression, a normalization that reflected the broader pattern of Cold War stability through managed injustice. The Berlin crisis of 1961 thus resolved the immediate question of control at the cost of freezing a divided Europe in place, creating a durable but morally fraught equilibrium that would endure until the geopolitical conditions sustaining it collapsed decades later. The crisis revealed how superpowers learned to live with unresolved contradictions, substituting containment for resolution and accepting walls, both physical and ideological, as the price of avoiding war. In this sense, Berlin became a microcosm of the Cold War itself, a place where confrontation was constant yet controlled, where symbols mattered as much as substance, and where the avoidance of catastrophe depended on restraint, communication, and the willingness to accept imperfect outcomes. The lessons drawn from 1961 would shape subsequent crises, informing how leaders approached escalation, signaling, and compromise in a world where missteps carried existential consequences, and reinforcing the paradox that peace in the nuclear age often rested not on justice or agreement, but on the careful management of fear. As the years passed, the Berlin Wall became both a physical barrier and a psychological boundary that reshaped the lived experience of the Cold War, embedding the lessons of the 1961 crisis into daily routines and long-term strategic thinking on both sides of the divide, as superpower confrontation settled into a tense but regulated pattern that prized predictability over resolution. For West Berliners, the city evolved into a fortified enclave sustained by Western political commitment, its survival guaranteed through economic subsidies, military presence, and symbolic gestures that reinforced its status as a front line of freedom, even as its isolation underscored the unnaturalness of division. For East Berliners and citizens of the German Democratic Republic, the wall hardened into an omnipresent instrument of control, its watchtowers, patrols, and minefields enforcing a reality in which dissent and escape carried mortal risk, and where the state's claim to legitimacy rested increasingly on coercion rather than consent. The broader strategic impact of the crisis lay in how it demonstrated the effectiveness of limited, controlled confrontation, as both superpowers learned that clearly defined red lines, once tested and respected, could stabilize even the most volatile situations, reducing the likelihood of accidental escalation while entrenching division. This understanding influenced subsequent Cold War behavior, encouraging the management of crises through signaling, negotiation, and incremental adjustment rather than sudden moves that could trigger uncontrollable responses. The Berlin experience also reinforced the importance of symbolism in Cold War politics, as the wall, the checkpoints, and the standoffs became powerful images that shaped global perceptions of the conflict, crystallizing ideological narratives in concrete form. For the United States and its allies, Berlin remained a test of credibility, a place where commitment had to be continually reaffirmed, even as the risk of direct confrontation was carefully contained. For the Soviet Union and East Germany, control of Berlin represented both a strategic necessity and an ideological embarrassment, a reminder that socialism in Germany required barriers to survive. The endurance of this arrangement revealed a paradox at the heart of the Cold War, that stability could be achieved through measures that were morally troubling and politically repressive, and that peace could coexist with injustice for extended periods. This paradox became increasingly apparent as generations grew up knowing no other reality, normalizing division while quietly questioning its permanence. The wall's existence influenced diplomacy and arms control, as Berlin ceased to be a flashpoint for immediate war, and instead became a backdrop against which broader negotiations unfolded, including efforts to reduce tensions and manage rivalry through treaties and dialogue. Yet the unresolved nature of Germany's division continued to shape European politics, serving as a constant reminder of the Cold War's unfinished business and the limits of superpower compromise. When the wall eventually fell in 1989, it did so not as a result of military confrontation, but through the erosion of legitimacy and the collapse of the structures that had sustained division, revealing how fragile the equilibrium established in 1961 had been beneath its apparent permanence. In retrospect, the Berlin crisis of 1961 stands as a defining moment in Cold War history, illustrating how close the world came to catastrophe over questions of access, authority, and symbolism, and how restraint and communication, rather than force, ultimately prevented disaster. The crisis demonstrated that while walls could freeze conflict, they could not resolve it, and that the stability achieved through division was contingent, dependent on broader geopolitical conditions that could change with little warning. The legacy of Berlin thus lies in its dual role as both warning and lesson, a reminder of the dangers inherent in divided sovereignty and nuclear brinkmanship, and an illustration of how imperfect solutions born of fear and necessity can shape history for decades. The story of the Berlin crisis is therefore not only about confrontation avoided, but about the long shadow cast by decisions made under pressure, decisions that preserved peace at the cost of freedom and left a divided city to bear the burden of a world unwilling to resolve its deepest contradictions. The final significance of the Berlin crisis of 1961 becomes clearest when viewed not as an isolated confrontation, but as a turning point in how the Cold War was managed, revealing a new, sobering maturity in superpower behavior that accepted division as preferable to destruction and restraint as the only viable path in a nuclear age. After the wall went up and the tanks withdrew, Berlin ceased to be a trigger for immediate war and instead became a controlled pressure point, a place where confrontation was ritualized, observed, and contained rather than allowed to spiral, reflecting a mutual, if unspoken, understanding that escalation over the city would serve no one's interests. This acceptance marked a shift away from the more volatile early Cold War years, when crises like the Berlin blockade and the Korean War had unfolded amid greater uncertainty about limits and intentions, and toward a pattern of managed rivalry grounded in clearer red lines and a deeper appreciation of nuclear risk. The cost of this stability was borne primarily by the people of Berlin and the divided German nation, whose lives were constrained by a geopolitical settlement they did not choose, and whose suffering was justified by leaders on both sides as necessary to preserve peace. The wall became a daily reminder that the Cold War's balance rested on coercion as much as consent, and that the avoidance of catastrophe often required the acceptance of injustice. For the United States, the crisis reinforced the principle that credibility could be maintained without military escalation, shaping a cautious approach to later confrontations that emphasized signaling and negotiation over force. While for the Soviet Union, it confirmed that decisive action, if carefully calibrated, could secure strategic objectives without provoking war. These lessons influenced subsequent Cold War crises, informing how leaders approached brinkmanship in moments of heightened tension and contributing to the development of communication channels designed to prevent miscalculation. The Berlin crisis also exposed the limits of ideological persuasion, as the need to seal the border revealed the inability of the East German state to retain its population voluntarily, undermining claims of socialist superiority and eroding legitimacy over time. This erosion would not produce immediate change, but it hollowed out the foundations of the system, ensuring that when external conditions shifted, the structures sustaining division would collapse rapidly. In this sense, the crisis planted the seeds of its own resolution, as the very measures taken to stabilize the situation ultimately exposed the fragility of the order they sought to preserve. The fall of the Berlin Wall, decades later, would retrospectively illuminate the crisis of 1961 as both an endpoint and a beginning, closing the era of open mobility that threatened East German survival, while inaugurating a long period of enforced stability that masked deepening decay. The Berlin crisis thus stands as one of the Cold War's most revealing episodes, demonstrating how the avoidance of war depended not on the resolution of conflict, but on the willingness to freeze it in place, and how peace in a divided world often rested on compromises that postponed reckoning rather than eliminated it. In remembering 1961, the crisis serves as a reminder that stability achieved through division is inherently temporary, and that the management of fear, while effective in the short term, cannot substitute indefinitely for legitimacy and consent. The legacy of Berlin is therefore not only the wall itself, but the lesson that even the most formidable barriers cannot permanently contain the human desire for freedom, and that the structures built to enforce geopolitical order ultimately depend on forces far more fragile than concrete and steel. The Berlin crisis of 1961 ultimately endures as one of the clearest demonstrations of how the Cold War was stabilized, not by resolving its deepest conflicts, but by learning how to contain them without catastrophe, a process that required leaders to accept morally compromised outcomes in exchange for survival in a nuclear world. The decision to tolerate the Berlin Wall, however bitter, reflected a collective recognition that certain injustices would be endured to avoid annihilation, and that credibility in the nuclear age depended as much on restraint as on resolve. For Berliners, this meant living for decades with the physical and emotional scars of division, while for the superpowers, it meant internalizing the lesson that direct confrontation carried unacceptable risks, shaping a pattern of behavior that would govern crises from Cuba to Central Europe. The wall froze history in place, but it also exposed the fundamental weakness of systems that required barriers to keep their citizens in, undermining ideological claims even as they enforced political order. Over time, this contradiction eroded legitimacy more effectively than any external pressure, ensuring that when the structures of control weakened, they would collapse with astonishing speed. In this sense, the Berlin crisis was not merely a moment of danger avoided, but a long-term turning point that revealed the limits of power exercised through coercion and the fragility of stability built on fear. It demonstrated that peace could be preserved through imperfect solutions, but that such peace carried costs deferred rather than resolved. When the Cold War finally ended, the Wall's fall retrospectively cast the events of 1961 in a stark light, revealing how close the world had come to disaster and how much had been sacrificed to prevent it. The legacy of the Berlin crisis thus lies in its paradox, that the same decisions that preserved peace also entrenched division, and that the avoidance of war depended on accepting outcomes that contradicted the values both sides claimed to defend. In the end, Berlin stands as a reminder that in the nuclear age, history was often shaped not by decisive victory or defeat, but by the careful management of fear, the willingness to compromise, and the recognition that survival itself had become the ultimate objective in a divided world.